2 days before the landing on Gallipoli in April 1915, Sergeant Benjamin Lean wrote a diary entry to his wife, Phyllis, back in Adelaide. "Dearest, we have just received orders to embark on the destroyers at 10:45 a.m. tomorrow. But if I am to die, know that I died loving you with my whole heart and soul. Dearest wife a man could ever have. Kiss little Gwen and our new baby, who perhaps I may never see, and never let them forget Daddy. And tell Mother that I'm not afraid to die, nor am I afraid of what is to come after death. And now, dear, dear sweetheart, goodbye, goodbye." Sergeant Lean was killed in action in Belcourt in April 1917. On the eve of the landing on the 25th of April 1915, Lieutenant Alan Henderson, an accountant from Melbourne, wrote, "It is going to be Australia's chance to make a tradition out of this, one that she must always look back on. God grant it will be a great one. The importance of this alone seems stupendous to Australia." Lieutenant Victor Pascoe of the 8th Battalion wrote to Lieutenant Maurice McLeod's mother, describing the death of her son during the Gallipoli landings. "It is beyond me to speak of him and what his life was at all times. I miss him sorely. He was always so bright and cheerful and helped men in many ways, unknown perhaps to himself. We both landed together under shrapnel fire from the enemy's guns and came through it safely. We took up position further inland and were lying behind the cover of some bushes when shrapnel shell burst overhead. 3 were hit, and in Maurice's case, death was instantaneous. Our casualties were very heavy that day, especially with officers, and I am still wondering how I came safely through it all myself. I hope you will excuse this penciled note. I've been a little ill myself, and I'm writing this in hospital. Maurice died fighting for his country and for you, surely something to be proud of." Driver Douglas Barrett Leonard, a Vigneron from Western Australia, was a member of the 3rd Field Artillery Brigade who was killed on Gallipoli on the 17th of July 1915. His mate, Corporal H.R. McGlarty, wrote home detailing the circumstances of his death. "This is how the men in this battery die. When the smoke from the bursting shells had cleared away, Wallace ran up to see the damage. He found Mick Taylor crawling around the ground, covered in blood and dazed. Bill said, 'Are you badly hit, Mick?' 'No, Bill,' he said. 'I'm only scratched. Look after Doug and Stan.' We subsequently found he had wounds in 14 places. Bill Wallace then picked up Doug Leonard. The poor lad had one arm blown off and one shattered leg at the thigh, and internal wounds. He said, 'I'm done. Look after Mick and Stan. Don't mind me.' Carter was leaning on the gun. He had a fearful wound in the side. He said, 'I'm sorry I'm moaning. I know it'll upset the others, but I can't help it. I can't help it.' He died, poor lad, almost immediately. His last words were, 'Did they get the gun?' Doug was in a fearful agony, but kept saying, 'I'm dying, but by God I'll die game.' He lingered for 2 hours, and it was a pitiful thing to watch. His last words were, 'I died at the gun, didn't I?' And so he went, dear lad, the most gallant, the most unselfish little soldier God ever made. He has taught us all how to die." We buried the dear lad side by side at midnight. It was a real soldier's burial. The minister's voice was drowned in the crack of bullets whistling overhead. And thus we left them. Private Victor Nicholson saw his mate Lofty killed at Quinn's Post on Gallipoli, shot through the eye while peeping through a loophole. "I didn't cry, unless Gallipoli was one long cry. If you cried once, you never stopped. There were friends going down every day, sometimes every hour of every day. Wonderful friends. I cried inwardly. That's all you could do." The Australian nurses on the hospital ships had to contend with a stream of wounded. Sister Ella Tucker of the Australian Army Nursing Service wrote, "The wounded men from the landing commenced to come on board at 9 a.m. and poured into the ship's wards from barges and boats. The majority still had on their field dressing, and a number of these wounds were soaked through. 2 orderlies cut off the patient's clothes, and I started immediately with the dressings. There were 76 patients in my ward, and I did not finish until 2 a.m. Sister Lydia King, on board the hospital ship HMHS Cecilia, was deeply affected by what she saw. "I shall never forget the awful feeling of hopelessness on night duty. It was dreadful. I had 2 wards downstairs, each over 100 patients, and then I had small wards upstairs, altogether 250 patients to look after. I shall not describe their wounds, they were too awful. One loses sight of all the honour and the glory in the work we are doing. Captain Frederick Tubb of the 7th Battalion described what he at Lone Pine in early August. We went in 670 strong and we came out 320. All the officers except the CO and Captain Lai were hit. I was extremely lucky and feel gratified for being alive and able to write. My luck was in all the time. It is miraculous that I am alive. 3 different times I was blown yards away from bombs. Burton of Euroa deserved the highest award for his gallant action for 3 times filling a breach in the parapet before they killed him. A lot more of our good old 7th are gone. Anyway, the CO is pleased with me and so is the Brigadier, so I feel happy as Larry. There were more than 2,000 Australian casualties at Lone Pine. Captain Tubb was one of the 7 Australians to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. Private Cecil McNulty of the 3rd Battalion also fought at Lone Pine. He made a last entry in his makeshift diary on 8 August. We were right out in the open and all the Turkish machine guns and rifles seemed to be playing on us and shrapnel bursting right over us. I yelled out to the other 4 chaps, "This is suicide, boys. I'm going to make a jump for it." I thought they said, "All right, we'll follow." I sprang to my feet in one jump. McNulty was killed in the fighting the following day. On the 7th of August, 33-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Alexander White led his 8th Light Horse Regiment in the ill-fated charge at the Neck. In the early hours of the morning, as he stood on the fire step in the trench with his watch in his hands, he said, "Men, you have 10 minutes to live, and I will lead you." When the whistle blew, all went over. White was dead within 10 paces. Of the 300 officers and men in the first 2 waves under his command, 183 died alongside him. Another 80 were wounded. White took 2 precious things with him to his death. The first was a gold locket on a chain containing a photo of his wife Myrtle and their infant son, young Bill. The second was a Bible and a newspaper cutting of a poem which read, "Let me be a little braver when temptation bids me waver. Let me strive a little harder to be all that I should be. Let me be a little meeker with the brother that is weaker. Let me think more of my neighbour and a little less of me." Captain Hugh Nivette described one of the self-forgetful actions ever performed during the fighting on the Western Front, performed by Gallipoli Veterinary Sergeant Alex Ross of the 57th Battalion. When we tried to pick him up, one by the shoulders and the other by the feet, it almost seemed that we would pull him apart. The blood was gushing from his mouth, where he had bitten through lips and tongue, so that he might not jeopardise, by groaning, the chances of some other man who was less badly wounded than he. He begged us to put him out of his misery, but we were determined we would give him his chance, though we did not expect him to live. But the sergeant threw himself down on the ground and made of his body a human sledge. Some others joined us, and we put the wounded man on his back and dragged thus across no man's land, through the broken barbed wire and shell-torn ground. Every few inches there were pieces of jagged shell and in and out of shell holes. So anxious were we to get to safety that we did not notice the condition of the man underneath until we got to our trenches. Then it was hard to see which was the worst wounded of the 2. The sergeant had his hands, face and body torn into ribbons, and we had never guessed it, for never once did he ask us to go slow or wait a bit. Such is the stuff that men are made of. Captain Albert McLeod of the 16th Battalion wrote the following to his wife. "Well, darling, on 12 o'clock tonight, we go over the parapet and then our fate is sealed. The place is like hell, but the sooner we get it over with, the better. I'll try, love, for your sake, to do well and come through. Remember me to baby when she is born. God be with you for all time." McLeod died in an accident whilst on leave on the 5th of December 1916. Harry Whiting wrote to his friend Hilda in 1919 from Villers-Bretonneux in France, describing work on the exhumation parties from which he had volunteered. Dear Hilda, the one which we are filling now is called the Adelaide Cemetery. We are raising the bodies of Tommies, Yanks, Canadians, New Zealand and Australians. We started on Monday last, and I can assure you it is a very unpleasant undertaking. Nearly all the men we have raised up to date have been killed 12 months, and they are far from being decayed properly, so you can guess the constitution one needs. I have felt sick dozens of times, but we carry on knowing that we are identifying Australian boys who have never been identified. They nearly all have some means of identification on them, and we make careful research for some, as it is cruel for their people's minds not to set at rest to know that their sons have been located. Many mothers picture their sons blown to pieces and no record, so now we hope to be able to identify 90% of the missing. Hilda, it is heartbreaking to see the way the poor fellows are buried. Perhaps I should not tell you, then again, it's to no harm. But we find dozens of them just in one big lump with their coats, equipment, gas helmets, and all on a heap of earth placed over them. We have a few hard-hearted fellows on the work, and they annoy the way they talk over the remains of the heroes. How thankful I am that my brothers Henry and Walter are placed decently away in a cemetery and will not have to be raised again. I've been out to see their graves, which are at La Motte Century. I have 2 marble slabs engraved to place at their crosses, which once I get sufficient tools, I'm going to nail both of their graves in. We shall never see them again, and I want to leave France knowing that I have done all within my power for both of them. I have photos taken of them, but none yet printed. I have seen a great part of the world since I left Australia. From your sincere friend, Harry.
Continuing the readings and representing the Royal Australian Air Force is Warrant Officer Suzanne Harvey.
During the Second World War in April 1941, Acting Corporal John Johnson from the 2nd 23rd Battalion wrote a letter home to his wife and 7 children in Australia describing life during the siege of Tobruk. Just endeavouring to write you a few lines under rotten conditions. There are dozens of things I'd like to tell you, but of course this is out of the question. The fleas are very bad here, but we are issued with powder, which I think they must eat and enjoy because they still crawl on you at night despite the use of the stuff. Picture armoured cars, tanks, trucks, motorbikes, men, guns, hospital tents, holes in the ground, shells bursting, artillery firing, aeroplanes flying, aircraft guns in action. Nighttime air raids, flares, signal bullets, red, green, white, searchlights, anti-aircraft shells bursting all over the sky, flash and glare of guns firing, war. 1 month after he wrote this, Johnson was shot during the fighting in an area of Tobruk known as the Salient. He refused medical attention until others had been attended to and died later that day. Serving in Britain, Flying Officer Frederick Kett of number 455 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, wrote home to his mother in March 1942. Please don't worry about what we are doing or what may happen to us. Being your sons means that whatever we do is to your credit, and that if anything should happen to us, you should still hold your head high. We realise that this war must be far more trying for you than for us. After all, we take things as they come, and the inclination is to become blasé about everything concerned with the war, other than carrying out our part of it with all the skill and success possible. Have been in several spectacular shows lately, although I cannot mention them by name. As you know, I am in Bomber Command, and I have been treated to some remarkable sights. The combination of red, yellow and green flak bursts, searchlights and traces, and huge fires at night is something apart from this world and has to be seen to be believed. Within weeks of writing this letter, both Frederick and his older brother, Flight Lieutenant Harry Keck, were killed in action. In late 1944, 20-year-old Flying Officer Colin Flockhart, a pilot officer flying 4-engine Avro Lancaster bombers with Bomber Command in Britain, wrote home to his parents in Sydney. "Never regret having given me your consent to enlist. I have been very proud to wear my uniform and have always striven to bring credit to the service as a whole. I believe in the cause for which we are fighting. I love you all dearly. Please don't think I'm pessimistic, but I do realise what the odds are, and I have seen too many of my friends pass without leaving any words of hope or encouragement behind. Cheerio and keep smiling though your hearts are breaking." Colin Flockhart was killed on the 7th of January 1945. When the battle cruiser HMS Repulse was sunk in late 1941, Lieutenant Paul Hayes was told by the medical officer of the rescuing ship that one of his 17-year-old Australian midshipmen was seriously wounded. Hayes later wrote to his wife about this young Australian officer. Among the other midshipmen, this young man had appeared the least developed. Immature for his age and often in trouble, he had seemed and looked a near child. He had been hit at his action station by a machine gun bullet from the last strafing run by a Japanese aircraft. I asked to be alone with him and took his hand. He gave me a brave smile which knifed into my heart and conscience for the previous admonishment I had bestowed on him. He held onto my hand with a firm little grip, as though trying to express his last tangible feeling in the young life he must have known was slipping away from him. I have never before or since seen death or the awareness of death in that moment of truth so transform youth to man. Suddenly he was an adult, brave and silently perceptive of the tragedy in which we were both enmeshed. He died that evening. Enduring brutal captivity as a prisoner of war of the Japanese, Sergeant Stan Arnell described the return of members of the 2nd 30th Battalion to Changi prison camp in late 1943 after toiling on the Burma-Thailand railway. It was a moonlit night and Changi, with the tropical waters around the island, was so beautiful. I can still hear the squeal of the brakes as the trucks lined up. The people from Changi knew we were coming and they came over to see us, to look for old friends and to see how we were. We got out of the trucks, a couple were dead, and we laid them on the ground and we lined up on the road. We were not ashamed because we were soldiers and we wanted to look like soldiers. The people from Changi stood back and uttered not a word. It was really quite strange. We lined up on the road as best we could and stood up as straight as we could. Those who couldn't stand up straight were on sticks, and those who couldn't stop shaking with malaria were held by their friends. We thought this is what we should do as soldiers, to say that we were not beaten. The Sergeant Major dressed us off and we stood in a straight line as he went over and reported to Major Johnson. Johnson went over to Black Jack Galligan and said, "Your 2nd 30th, all present and correct, sir." And Galligan said, "Where are the rest?" The Major said, "They're all here, sir." And we were. Black Jack Galligan, the Iron Man, broke down and cried. It was an incredible scene. We wanted to show them that we were soldiers. Closer to home, Sergeant Jack Sim of the 39th Battalion described the conditions along the Kokoda Trail in Papua during 1942. "Oh, it was murderous. It was that hard. You know what was our worst enemy? The terrain. You perspired all day. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it would rain, so you were continually wet. And it was so cold at night. It was so cold at night and boiling hot in the daytime. Some prayed, some swore with fear, but you couldn't show it in front of your mates. One of the boys got shot fair between the eyes right alongside of me. It was a perfect shot. Buggers. They used to attack us by screaming out. It's terrible to be afraid, yet it's the brave ones that are afraid and still keep going. That's what they did, you know. Scared bloody stiff and still kept going. They were so young. They were so young. I love them all. Nobody went to that war, or any other I suppose, that didn't get wounded mentally, if not physically. It wasn't possible. During the desperate fighting along the Kokoda Trail, Corporal John Metzen from the 2nd 14th Battalion was wounded during the Battle of Issawa. His ankle smashed by a bullet, he refused to be evacuated on a stretcher and instead padded his hands and knees in order to crawl behind the stretcher bearers. He crawled on his hands for 3 weeks with a party that became cut off from the main track. Despite his courage and tenacity, Metzen was eventually discovered by the Japanese and was executed on the 4th of October 1942. His mate Les Cook, himself a Kokoda veteran from the 2nd 14th Battalion, later wrote, "When you stand in silent remembrance on Anzac Day, or significant anniversaries such as today, or when you stand before a cenotaph or at the gates of a war cemetery and read the words, 'Their name liveth forevermore,' think of John Metzen, of his fortitude, his determination not to be a burden to others, and his cheerful acceptance of the awful situation into which he had been thrust." In the final year of the Second World War, 26-year-old South Australian Lieutenant Colin Simper wrote to his wife Irene and mother of his 2 young children, "I don't think you understand my position here, honey. Admittedly, I see a lot of dead and a lot of killing, but it's only the man who has it day and night for months on end that is liable to be affected by it. No, I think you may rest assured it won't affect me unless it is to make me love you more and look forward to peace and our life together." Colin Simper died of wounds on Tarankan Island, Borneo, on the 9th of June 1945. During times of war and peace, Australian men and women have been motivated to serve our nation for many different reasons. Captain Reg Saunders served in the Army during the Second World War and the Korean War, fighting in the Middle East, Crete, New Guinea and Capion. He was a proud Aboriginal Australian. "I never fought for anybody but Australia. I was always loyal to my country. I fought for the Queen of Australia or the King of Australia. I didn't want the King or the Queen of England because I'd have just been as happy fighting against them. Australia is my country. I love my country very much and I like the people in Australia, so my loyalty was purely Australian. We were the first defenders of Australia. The English never ever defended Australia at all. We did, and we suffered very badly for that, decimated to hell." In 1944, another Aboriginal soldier, Charles Menn, stressed that his motivation for undertaking military service was directly related to citizenship rights and equality for Indigenous people. "I know that I am fighting for a new world in which my people will get a better deal. I want to come back to an Australia where my people will have full rights as citizens, to an Australia where Aboriginal children will have the right to education, to work, and to a happy, healthy life." With a 22-year Army career, Corporal Menn served in the Second World War and in the Malayan Emergency, was part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force and was decorated for his service during the Korean War. During the Korean War, Lieutenant Colin Kahn of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was wounded during a night patrol on the 11th of November 1952. "I remember dying. I went up in the air and I saw myself lying on that hill, dead. I was in no pain. I was terribly content and happy. I thought of my wife and I thought I had to come back. And then it all started to hurt." Writing many years after the conflict, Sergeant Brian Cooper, recipient of the Military Medal, recorded his time serving with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. "I believe the experience I had of war in Korea at the age of 19 years had a more profound effect on my personal life and subsequent behaviour than any other event before or since. That experience shaped my personality in ways I think I would have preferred to have avoided, and much of what I was when I returned from Korea is still with me today. Private Brian Hawes, a national serviceman with the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment during the Vietnam War, later recalled the Battle of Lon Tan on the 18th of August 1966. It was the first contact we'd had. Because we trained so well before going to Vietnam, it was a natural reaction bred into us. We all went to cover. Section commanders took control and moved us back. For the full duration, we were out there by ourselves. It was very well controlled. Everybody knew what the bloke next to him was doing and how he was reacting and how you were reacting. It was like a very tight family. We all worked together. That control came from Lieutenant Sharp, down through the section commanders, and even after Sharp was killed, the control was there in Sergeant Bob Buick, who took over control of the platoon.
Getting closer, I realised that the heap was composed of dead and wounded soldiers. In amongst the carnage, I came across the body of Mick Poole. He had just turned 20 and was a favourite with the village kids because of his cheeky good humour. He played the tenor horn in the battalion band. On patrol, bandsmen acted as stretcher bearers and provided first aid. I caught up with the Bravo Company medic and 3 more stretcher bearers, all dazed and wounded, but getting on with tackling what lay at hand. 7 Australian soldiers died and 28 were wounded, 2 of whom later died of their wounds. Sergeant Terry Pickard of the Royal Australian Army Medical Corps described his experience in Kapeho while serving with the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda in 1995. I saw Jordo yelling and waving at one child who was confused about which way to go. Jordo was trying to get this boy to come to us, but he was so scared that he froze. With so many rounds flying around, he would have not lasted long. It was then that I saw Jordo do the most amazing and bravest thing I've ever witnessed. He ran to the boy, who was stuck in an area under intense fire, grabbed him in both arms and ran back to us. Jordo put the boy in the back of the truck where Nico was looking after several refugees, awaiting evacuation to the landing zone. He then went back to the patient he had been treating as if nothing had happened. Sergeant C. Fallon served with the Ordnance Corps in Rotary Wing Group Kandahar, Afghanistan. At this moment, I am proud of my wife and her efforts back home, proud of country, proud that I am serving my country, proud of my mate's service, and proud of the sacrifices we all make in order to serve. As the unmistakable thud of the chook taking off resonates around the airfield, I close my eyes and say a little prayer for the team heading out and wish them well as they head into the darkness. I will catch a couple of hours sleep and do it all over again because this is what I do and where I want to be. In Afghanistan, Australians and our Afghan allies confronted a ruthless enemy. David Savage, a civilian working with AusAid, was badly wounded by a child suicide bomber. There's no doubt that to recover from such a blast is both a physical and a psychological journey. I think one of the biggest impacts is on the family. They see how vulnerable you really are and the effect that an injury or injuries can have. My wife hasn't been back to work since that time. She's been my full-time carer. It's an ongoing thing and it's an ongoing effect on everybody. On 18 July 2009, an improvised explosive device seriously wounded Private Paul Warren of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. The explosion ripped off Warren's right leg and killed his friend, Private Ben Ronaldo. Ben was a guy you really wanted to be around. To be in his section was really a privilege. And all the guys that worked with him would say that. He had his whole life ahead of him. My son, His name's Jack Benjamin after him, and he'll grow up to know the person that he's named after. A lot of us that served with Ben, it's our job to make sure that this guy's memory and name lives on. I've had a few mates now not come home, and I hope their memories live forever. Nate Gallagher, Matthew Lambert, exceptional soldiers. They saw what happened to other people and still wanted to go and do their job. Your mates are what makes being a soldier special. You eat together, you sleep together on the ground together. They're closer than your family over there. You trust the man next to you with your life, and you'd expect he would do the same. That's what's make you proud. Not the unit you're from, not who's the CO at the time, it's your mates. Squadron Leader Sharon Bound, Commander of the Royal Australian Air Force Combat Surgical Team in Afghanistan, reflected on her service. I have awaited their return and tended their wounds, never able to fully comprehend the darkness of man that they have encountered upon their journey. I have witnessed their adrenaline-fueled highs of survival and their immense depths of despair at the loss of a mate. I have laughed reservedly at the often black humoured stories of soldiers who photograph their legs before a patrol, just in case they never saw them again, and face the reality of their need to loosely wear a tourniquet on each limb, ready to stem the almost inevitable hemorrhage that could end their life. I have been privileged to hear of unimaginable acts of bravery and self-preservation, and I have stood by silently to attempt to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. I have worn their blood. So many of us have worn their blood. In southern Afghanistan, Australian soldiers fought their fiercest contact and battles since the Vietnam War. Many of these actions were fought by Australia's Special Forces. A member of the Special Air Service Regiment described the actions of a comrade at Chora Pass in Uruzgan Province in 2006. The boys were taking a pasting. Recoilless rifle, mortar, machine gun and RPG fire was pouring in. That's when one of our cars was hit with an RPG. Out of the three of them, he was the only one left unscathed. The crew commander got it the worst, took some bad shrapnel in the neck and face and fell out of the car. And even with all that fire coming in, he just ran around to the exposed side of the car and picked his crew commander up, put him back in the vehicle and held on to him as he drove through the most horrendous fire the boys had ever seen to safety. Mateship at its finest. One of the largest battles was fought in 2010 against insurgent strongholds around Chinatu and Tizak in the Shah Walikot district of Kandahar province in southern Afghanistan. After the action, the 2nd Commando Regiment Sergeant Gary Robinson remarked, "It was tense, hot and arduous. It was kill or be killed. They were trying to kill me, so I had no remorse." Following the fight at Tizak, Sergeant S from the Special Air Service Regiment recalled the significance of mateship. To fail would be worse than death. To let down your mates in combat would be worse than death. I don't even know why I'm getting emotional about this. Yeah, that's it. That's the essence. You don't let your mates down. Sergeant Brett Till, an explosive ordnance disposal technician from the Incident Response Regiment, was killed disarming an improvised explosive device in southern Afghanistan on 19 March 2009. Despite the risks, Warrant Officer Dan Costello reflected on the need to carry on the dangerous work of the engineers. After we put Brett on the helicopter and watched him fly off, I walked back to the SSM of Bravo Company. Tears rolling down my face and my glasses on, I said, "Well, what do I do now? I've never done this before. Who prepares for this sort of stuff?" It was Major Wakelin that gave me the confidence to keep going. He said, "Mate, as traumatic as it is losing a mate and Brett's death, there's 144 fellas that you need, and we've got a mission to complete. I need you and your men to get us to Helmand. So I had to walk back 44 vehicles to the front of mine, compose myself, and get my blokes back in the means to keep going. I said, fellas, I'm hurting as much as you are at this stage. I was crying in front of them as well. It was horrific what happened. I can't put your minds at ease, but I'm going out in front to keep going. There are 144 fellas behind us that are shit scared and won't do anything without us. Who's coming with me? 2 blokes put their hand up, Whitey and Jeffro, and off we went. And we kept going and then kept going all that night. When I got back after that rotation, I met the family and I met Bree, Brett's widow. He had an unborn child he never got to see and his kids. The thing that holds me the most is that I made promises that I couldn't keep. I know now you can't make those sorts of promises because of war. 30-year-old Private Gregory Sher from the 1st Commando Regiment was killed in a rocket attack in Uruzgan Province on 4 January 2009. Sher had not told his parents he was being deployed to Afghanistan. He had not wanted to worry them. Greg's mother, Yvonne Sher, recently reflected. He was a wonderful son. He was kind and compassionate. He had a wonderful sense of humour and full of fun. He just wanted to get out there and have fun and enjoy life. He wanted to contribute to the country and to, if possible, make a difference to those less fortunate than himself. Greg's father, Felix Sher, remarked, I was in retrospect disappointed that I didn't have the opportunity to wish him well and wish him the best of luck in the situation. So that's the one part that I really sort of still hurts and lingers, that I didn't have the opportunity to actually say a proper goodbye. On 23 May 2011, Sergeant Brett Wood, a well-respected and highly decorated soldier from the 2nd Commando Regiment, was killed by an improvised explosive device during an operation in Afghanistan. His widow, L.V. Wood, later described the loss of her husband. I woke up because my phone was ringing, and it was Brett's best friend. And it didn't click, because I didn't understand why he'd be calling me at 5 a.m. And when I went to pick up the phone, I heard the doorbell ringing at the same time. So I just went downstairs, turned on the light, and opened the door. And you read about it in books, and you see it in TV shows and on movies, where someone opens the door and there's a man or woman there in uniform. But to actually have it happen, I can't even put it into words. You feel like you're in a dream. I can't be bitter. I'm sad. I'm really sad that he doesn't get to live his life, that he doesn't get to see his dreams come true. But I can't be bitter because he was doing what he loved. He wanted to serve his country and to keep supporting that. He was one of the proudest Australians I've ever met. Every time he would go away, coming home to him made him even more grateful to live here, to be an Australian, to have all that freedom we have.
So basically I just remember the dust. I was lifted into the air. I landed. I tried to crawl, looking for Ben, and realised that wasn't working too well. I looked down and my right leg was gone just below the knee. Ben will never. His picture sits in my lounge room along with Nate Gallagher's. My son is named Jax Benjamin after him, and he'll grow up to know the person that he's named after. I don't really know any other way to put it, but he'll never be forgotten.
You read about it in books and you see it in TV shows and on movies where someone opens the door and there are men and women there in uniform, but to actually have it happen, I can't even put it into words. I'm sad. I'm really sad that he doesn't get to live his life. But I can't be bitter because he was doing what he loved. He wanted to serve his country. To be bitter about that would be really letting go of what he believed in.
It probably took 15 minutes for my medic to arrive, which sounds like a long time, but when you think about the fact that he was 2 kilometres away and he ran 2 kilometres, carrying 30 kilos to get to him, he could have won an Olympic medal for how fast he ran that day. I grabbed his hand and I said, "Stay with me." I said, "Stay with me, Jonesy."
Mentoring team, Alpha, officers, salute!
As an officer, you get taught that, one day one of your soldiers may die, but nothing ever prepares you for that. Nothing ever prepares you for losing someone that you were responsible for, that their family had entrusted you to look after them. And, he was one of my guys, he was part of my family.
There was tears rolling down my face and I had my glasses on and everything, and I said, well, what do I do now? I've never done this before. Who prepares for this sort of stuff? Which you don't. So I got back there and I said, fellas, I'm hurting as much as you are, but, I'm going back out the front to keep going. There's 144 fellas behind us that won't do anything without us. I said, so who's come with me? And then 2 blokes put their hands up, which was Whitey and Jeffro, and off we went. I remember when I got back after that rotation, I met the family and I met Bree, and that was, I thought it was hard doing the memorial service when we got back to TK, but more so seeing Bree because, he had an unborn child that he never got to see, and his kids. And the thing that holds me the most is that I made promises that I couldn't keep.
He was a man among the soldiers, but not upon the fields. He flew up high in the sky as a moving defense shield. When he went to war, he risked his life without a family or a wife. He was brave, honest, and always true, never envious and seldom blue. He was a man among the soldiers, Arthur Tucker was his name. My gaffer, he is gone now, but I love him just the same.
Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you come waltzing Matilda with me. Good night, Matilda, too.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard a few of the reflections of those affected by military service in Afghanistan, along with the voice of Beatrice Tucker singing about her grandfather, followed by Lee Kernighan's slow refrain of Waltzing Matilda. Still projecting onto the memorial's dome are the names of each of the 62,000 Australians listed on the First World War Roll of Honour in the commemorative area. Well, these projections commenced on the 4th of August 2014, the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War. Each and every name reminds us to look beyond the broad brushstrokes of history, to remember the individual sacrifices made in our name. As the band and catafalque party move into place for the start of the dawn service, I ask that you turn off your mobile phones in keeping with the silence and the dignity of the occasion. Now, should you require it, first aid is located near the entrance to the main building on my left, under the trees, and to my right, at the lower entry to the parade ground. Now, for more pressing requirements, please seek assistance from memorial staff who are wearing high visibility vests. Lighting is being progressively turned off across the memorial and the surrounding grounds as we prepare for the start of the dawn service, which will begin at 5:30. Well, from the parapet of the memorial, playing the didgeridoo was Wing Commander Jonathan Lilly. Wing Commander Lilly is a member of the Warramai people of Williamtown, north of Newcastle in New South Wales. We welcome the veterans who have served, those who are still serving, and the families who love and support them. We also welcome our viewers and listeners on the ABC and the many visitors who have joined us here today, which is being held here at the dawn service on the parade ground in front of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where it is just after 5:30 and the sun has not yet risen. Ladies and gentlemen, a catafalque party provided by Australia's Federation Guard is mounted at the Stone of Remembrance. The catafalque party consists of a commander and 4 members. These members represent the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army, and the Royal Australian Air Force. We assemble this way every year, symbolically close to the time that the first Anzacs, those young men from Australia and New Zealand, landed on a Turkish beach during the First World War. We gather to honour their bravery, to honour their courage, their selfless comradeship, and their sacrifice under the most awful conditions. These were the men who created for their homelands the spirit of Anzac, a spirit that gives us pride in who we are, and it sets the standard for our defence forces today. A spirit that is being upheld in a number of operations around the world. Well, today we remember the Anzacs of 1915 and all those who have followed in their footsteps. We especially remember those who gave their lives, those who gave their good health, and those who grieved for them. The Anzac dedication will now be delivered by Chaplain Peter Willis of the Australian Army.
At this hour, on this day, 103 years ago, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps at Gallipoli made immortal the name of Anzac and established an imperishable tradition of selfless service, of devotion to duty, and of fighting for all that is best in human relationships. We who are gathered here today in this dawn vigil remember with gratitude the men and women who have given and are still giving in our armed and supporting services all that is theirs to give, in order that the world may be a nobler place in which to live. And with them, we remember those who are left behind to bear the sorrow of their loss. Let us therefore dedicate ourselves to taking up the burdens of the fallen and, with the same high courage and steadfastness with which they went into battle, set our hands to the tasks they left unfinished. Let us dedicate ourselves to the service of the ideals for which they died. Let us, with God's help, give our utmost to make the world what they would have wished it to be, a better and happier place for all of its people, through whatever means are open to us.
On this day, 103 years ago, Australians and New Zealanders fought side by side, landing in a place far from their homelands, a place that would become known as Anzac Cove. In over a century of service, the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces have continued to serve together across the world in war, in operations and peacekeeping. As a mark of the strong bond of comradeship within which our two nations still live, wreaths will be laid at the Stone of Remembrance.
pray. Creator, Lord of all things, you have made all nations and you care for all peoples. Today we remember your call for us to live together in peace. Help us to overcome the divisions keeping us from peace. Bless, we pray, every effort being made to bring peace and understanding to our world, so that we may learn your ways and serve your will. Lord God, we remember those who have died and served in all wars. We think of those who departed the safety of our own shores for the discomfort, uncertainty, and horrors of war in foreign lands. And we acknowledge who still lay where they fell, in unknown resting places, and those whose grave is the unending sea. We remember with extreme gratitude those who, in their efforts to secure our freedom, died in time of war. We thank you for all those who did not count their lives dear to themselves, but laid them down for our sakes. Let the memory of their devotion and sacrifice always be an example to us, that we may live as faithful servants of him who died for our eternal salvation. We look forward with hope to that time when we will join with all who have died with faith in the joy of your heavenly kingdom, where sorrow and pain are no more and where every tear will be wiped away. We also recognise and remember with compassion those who still suffer as the result of war. We pray for those who mourn, for the injured and disabled, the homeless and hungry, the mentally distressed, for those suffering moral injury, and those who are without hope or friend to sustain them in their grief. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer, and do not forget them or us as we strive to live in peace with you and each other. I pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen. I now invite those of you who wish to say with me the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
The dawn service address will be delivered by Surgeon and Australian Army veteran, Colonel Susan Newhouse.
As a small child, I remember being rugged up in a parka and mittens and taken to a chilly dawn service. It was a service I didn't understand, a service of silence, of half-murmured hymns, and of old men lost in their own thoughts. And yet somehow, those stories of service and sacrifice wound themselves into my DNA. Like most Australians today, I have no faded photographs of men or women in uniform on my mantelpiece. And I know of no family members who served on the beaches of Gallipoli, the muddy fields of the Somme, or indeed the jungles of Southeast Asia. And yet, like all of us, I benefit from what they have done. Inscribed into these walls, here, at our nation's memorial are the names of more than 102,000 Australians. Australians from all walks of life. Australians by birth. Australians by choice. Indigenous Australians who have lived and fought and died for our country, their country, the country of their ancestors. And there are also the names of women, women who from the Boer War onwards have served with gallantry, have been prisoners of war, and have died wearing the uniform of this nation. From the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific to the desert sands of the Western Sahara. They include a group of 22 nurses of the Australian Army Nursing Service, evacuated from Singapore. When their ship, the Vina Brook, was torpedoed in the Banker Straits, they swam through the night to the shore. There, on Monday, the 16th of February, 1942, shortly after 10 a.m, they were lined up along the beach, still in their uniforms, a red cross emblazoned into their left sleeve, and at bayonet point, they were ordered into the sea. They were under no illusion as to their fate. In those last moments, before the machine guns opened fire, Matron Drummond turned to her nurses with words of comfort and of courage. And her words speak for a nation. Chins up, girls. I'm proud of you. And I love you all. Behind every name on every memorial, large and small, across this nation, there is a story of courage. And for every name, there is another story, a story of loss, of family, of friends, and of those left behind. Each one a narrative thread in the fabric of service that underpins our nation. Each a thread extending from the sands of Gallipoli to the men and women of the Royal Australian Navy, our Army, and the Royal Australian Air Force that stand on duty today on operations worldwide. As I stand here today, my understanding of Anzac Day has also changed. I have been privileged to wear the uniform of the Australian Army, and now, as a veteran myself, I reflect on how very fortunate I am to have come home safely, changed but undamaged by all that I have seen and done. Today, my thoughts are with those who I've served with, some of whom I knew, many more that I didn't, whose names are now also inscribed into the walls behind me. And I think of the names that have sadly yet to be written, and of those whose names will never be recorded, even though their wounds, not always visible, are carved just as deeply into them as names into granite. As a surgeon, I reflect on the cruelty and devastation of which humans are capable, on a century of severed limbs and broken bodies, from the industrial carnage of the Western Front to the indiscriminate weapons of today's adversaries that target soldiers and civilians alike. As a mother, I recall with great clarity kissing my own two daughters goodnight before I left for Afghanistan. And my heart aches for all those who have farewelled loved ones to war, some to never return, others to return forever changed, haunted by the ghosts of their own experience. But as an Australian, I stand here in awe of what those who have gone before have given me. Because every Australian, regardless of whether we have a direct link to those who wore the uniform or not, is a recipient of their sacrifice and of their hope that we, who are left to grow old, would live in a country at peace, a prosperous country, a country where we were each free to vote, to choose our own paths through life, to marry whom we please, and where we hold fast the hope that our children will have those same freedoms. Now I understand that when the bugler sounds the reveille, the call to awaken, it is not a call to the dead, it is a call to the living, and it calls to each of us. That we might use the threads of their sacrifice to strengthen the fabric of this nation. That we might live our lives with the same courage, the same loyalty. That we might be imbued with fairness and compassion for those less fortunate than ourselves, and set an example for the next generation of children, wrapped up against the cold and the dark of the dawn. And then, perhaps, if the so many who sacrificed so much were to walk amongst us today, they might say, "We too are proud of you," lest we forget.
Colonel Newhouse, thank you for your words, for your insights, and for reminding us all of why we are here this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, the ode will now be recited by the President of the ACT branch of the Returned and Services League of Australia, Mr. John King. The ode will be followed by the last post, a minute's silence, and the reveille.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Ladies and gentlemen, Junior Legatee Liam Wakaba will recite an extract from the poem In Flanders Fields. Now, this poem was written by John McCrae while serving in Flanders, Belgium. A Canadian Army doctor, McCrae died during the First World War on the Western Front.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the cross, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely sing, flies scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. Now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up a quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honour all people. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit, and the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, be with you and remain with you always. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to now please join in singing the national anthem.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and a wealth for toil. Our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the dawn service. Would you please remain in position until the official party has departed the dais?